The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic and straightened his black bearskin hat. At 25 years old, Thomas had served as one of the Queen's Guards for 3 years, but he still felt the weight of responsibility every time he took his position outside the palace gates. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the stoic figures who had become symbols of British tradition and unwavering discipline. Thomas came from a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Navy, and his grandfather had been a guardsman during World War II. The family legacy of service ran deep in his blood, and Thomas took immense pride in continuing that tradition. He had trained rigorously for months before earning his position, learning not just the physical demands of standing motionless for hours, but also the mental discipline required to ignore distractions, provocations, and the constant attention of curious onlookers. The Queen's Guard was no ordinary military unit. These soldiers were handpicked from elite regiments, including the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards. Their primary duty was to protect the royal residences, but they had also become one of London's most photographed attractions. Tourists would often try to make them laugh, move, or break their stoic composure, but the guards were trained to remain perfectly still and silent, unless facing a genuine security threat. As Thomas took his position that Tuesday morning, he noticed the usual crowd beginning to form. School children on field trips pointed excitedly at his uniform, while parents snapped photos and videos. Some visitors would wave enthusiastically, hoping for any sign of acknowledgement, while others would make silly faces or tell jokes, trying to crack the guard's famous composure. Thomas had seen it all before, and he maintained his 1,000-yard stare, looking straight ahead as if the crowd didn't exist. The morning passed peacefully, with only the typical tourist antics to navigate. Thomas's mind wandered to his girlfriend Sarah, who worked as a nurse at a London hospital. They had plans to meet for dinner that evening, and he was looking forward to sharing stories from their respective days. She always found his guard duty tales amusing, especially the more ridiculous attempts by tourists to get his attention. Around midday, Thomas noticed a shift in the crowd's energy. People were stepping back and creating a path as someone approached the palace gates. Through his peripheral vision, he could see a tall figure in military dress uniform walking purposefully toward his position. The man's bearing suggested high rank, and his uniform was pristine with numerous medals and insignia displayed prominently across his chest. The approaching figure was General Harrison Blackwell, a decorated officer who had recently returned from an overseas posting. General Blackwell had built his reputation on strict discipline and absolute respect for military hierarchy. He was known throughout the armed forces as a demanding leader who expected immediate compliance with his orders and had little patience for what he considered breaches of military protocol. As General Blackwell drew closer to Thomas's position, the crowd grew quieter, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The general's expression was stern, and his pace was measured and deliberate. Thomas could feel the tension building, though he maintained his rigid posture and continued staring straight ahead, as his training dictated. The general stopped directly in front of Thomas, close enough that the guardsman could smell his cologne and hear his breathing. For several long moments, nothing happened. The crowd watched in fascination, cameras and phones recording every second of the encounter. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on the distance, his breathing controlled and steady. General Blackwell began to circle Thomas slowly, examining his uniform, his posture, and his discipline. The general's military-trained eye was clearly assessing every detail of the young guardsman's appearance and bearing. Thomas could feel the intense scrutiny but refused to acknowledge it in any way. This was exactly the type of situation his training had prepared him for, and he was determined to uphold the honor and tradition of the Queen's Guard. The crowd continued to watch in captivated silence, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Parents pulled their children closer, and tourists stopped their chatter to focus on the unfolding drama. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, as everyone wondered what would happen next in this unexpected encounter between the high-ranking general and the steadfast guardsman. General Blackwell completed his circle around Thomas and positioned himself directly in the guardsman's line of sight, though Thomas continued to stare through him as if he were invisible. The general's jaw tightened, clearly expecting some form of acknowledgement of his presence and rank. In most military situations, a soldier would immediately snap to attention and salute when a general approached, but the Queen's Guard operated under different protocols. The silence stretched on for nearly 5 minutes, with the general standing mere inches from Thomas's face. Sweat began to form on Thomas's brow under his heavy bearskin hat, but he didn't move a muscle. His training had taught him that the Queen's Guard acknowledged only specific threats or direct orders from their immediate superiors in the guard hierarchy. A general from another unit, regardless of rank, did not have the authority to break their ceremonial duty. General Blackwell's face began to redden with frustration. He was accustomed to immediate respect and deference from all military personnel, and this apparent disregard for his authority was both puzzling and infuriating. The crowd sensed the mounting tension, and some tourists began whispering among themselves, wondering if they should continue filming or step away from what appeared to be an increasingly volatile situation. Finally, General Blackwell spoke, his voice sharp and commanding. "Guardsman, I am General Harrison Blackwell of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. You will acknowledge my presence and show proper military courtesy." His words carried the weight of decades of military authority, and several people in the crowd instinctively straightened their own postures in response to his commanding tone. Thomas remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the general's shoulder. His breathing stayed controlled and even, though inside his chest his heart was racing. This was an unprecedented situation in his 3 years of guard duty. He had dealt with drunk tourists, protesters, and even minor security incidents, but never had a high-ranking military officer directly confronted him while on duty. The general's expression darkened further as his command went unheeded. He stepped even closer to Thomas, their faces now only inches apart. "Soldier, I am giving you a direct order to acknowledge my rank and position. Your failure to respond is a clear violation of military protocol and shows disrespect for the chain of command." The crowd was now completely silent, hanging on every word of this extraordinary confrontation. Camera phones were recording from multiple angles, and several tourists had called their friends over to witness the drama unfolding before them. Some visitors looked uncomfortable, sensing they might be watching a serious breach of military discipline, while others were fascinated by this real-life display of military tension. Thomas's training echoed in his mind. The Queen's Guard manual was explicit about their duties and the circumstances under which they could break their ceremonial stance. Only direct threats to the royal family, the palace, or explicit orders from their guard commanders could interrupt their duty. A general from outside their chain of command, despite his rank, did not meet these criteria. General Blackwell began pacing back and forth in front of Thomas, his voice rising with each word. "In 30 years of military service, I have never encountered such blatant disrespect for authority. Your conduct is disgraceful and reflects poorly on the entire military establishment." His metals clinked softly against each other as he moved, and his polished boots echoed on the cobblestones. The situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present. Some tourists began to back away, sensing that they might be witnessing the prelude to a serious military disciplinary action. Others remained fixed in place, unwilling to miss what they perceived as a once-in-a-lifetime encounter between military tradition and authority. Thomas could feel perspiration running down his back inside his thick wool uniform, but his face remained impassive. His grandfather's stories about maintaining discipline under pressure during wartime flashed through his mind. The old man had always emphasized that a true soldier's greatest strength was not in his weapons or his physical prowess, but in his ability to maintain composure and follow orders regardless of external pressure. General Blackwell's frustration was now clearly visible to everyone present. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The contrast between his agitated state and Thomas's perfect stillness was striking, and several onlookers began to realize they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple military encounter. The general made one final attempt to assert his authority, moving so close to Thomas that their noses nearly touched. "Guardsman, this is your last opportunity to show proper military respect. I am ordering you to acknowledge my presence and explain your conduct." His voice was now loud enough that people across the street could hear every word, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas remained perfectly still as the general's final ultimatum hung in the air. The crowd had grown significantly larger, with people stopping their daily routines to witness this unprecedented confrontation. Shop owners from nearby stores had stepped outside, and even some palace staff had discreetly positioned themselves where they could observe the situation while remaining at a respectful distance. General Blackwell's breathing was now visibly labored, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his decorated uniform. The veins in his neck were prominent, and his face had progressed from red to a deep purple hue. He had never experienced such a direct challenge to his authority, and his military training had not prepared him for a situation where his rank seemed to carry no weight whatsoever. A small child in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Mummy, why is the angry man shouting at the soldier?" The innocent question carried across the silent gathering, and several adults shifted uncomfortably, realizing that this confrontation was becoming increasingly inappropriate for the public setting. Thomas's peripheral vision caught sight of two fellow guardsmen at nearby posts, both maintaining their own stoic positions, but clearly aware of the situation unfolding with their colleague. He knew that they were trained to assist only if there was a genuine security threat, and this situation, while intense, did not yet qualify as such a threat. General Blackwell began to pace more frantically, his polished boots clicking rapidly against the cobblestones. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he muttered, though his voice was still loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "In my entire career, I have never witnessed such flagrant disregard for military hierarchy. This guardsman's behavior is a disgrace to the uniform he wears." An elderly gentleman in the crowd, wearing a Royal Navy veteran's pin on his jacket, stepped forward slightly and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, General," he said respectfully, "but I believe the Queen's Guard operates under special protocols. They're not permitted to break their ceremonial duties except under very specific circumstances." General Blackwell whirled around to face the veteran, his eyes blazing with indignation. "Are you questioning my understanding of military protocol, civilian?" The word civilian dripped with disdain, despite the man's obvious military background indicated by his bearing and veteran's insignia. The veteran maintained his respectful demeanor, but stood his ground. "Not at all, sir. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps the guardsman is following his specific orders correctly. The Queen's Guard has maintained these traditions for centuries, and their protocols are quite distinct from regular military units." This intervention only seemed to fuel General Blackwell's rage further. He turned back to Thomas with renewed fury, his voice now reaching a volume that could be heard several blocks away. "I don't care what special protocols you think you're following, soldier. When a general officer addresses you, you respond immediately. Your silence is nothing more than insubordination." Thomas's mind raced through his extensive training. He remembered the words of his drill instructor during guard preparation. "Your duty is to the crown and to the protection of the royal residences. Nothing and no one comes before that responsibility. Not weather, not fatigue, not embarrassment, and not pressure from any source outside your direct chain of command." The standoff had now lasted nearly 20 minutes, and the crowd had swelled to over 100 people. News of the confrontation was spreading through social media, with multiple videos already being uploaded and shared. The hashtag Queen's Guard standoff was beginning to trend on various platforms, turning this local incident into an international spectacle. A tour guide with a group of American tourists approached the edge of the crowd, trying to understand what was happening. When the situation was explained to her, she nodded knowingly and addressed her group. "This is actually a perfect example of the discipline and dedication that makes the Queen's Guard so famous worldwide. They take their duty very seriously and cannot be distracted from it." General Blackwell overheard the tour guide's explanation and turned toward her with wild eyes. "This is not dedication, it's defiance. This soldier is deliberately ignoring a direct order from a superior officer. In any other military context, this would result in immediate court-martial proceedings." The tour guide, a British woman in her 50s with years of experience dealing with difficult situations, smiled diplomatically. "Perhaps, General, but the Queen's Guard answers to a different authority. They're not just soldiers. They're guardians of tradition and symbols of our national heritage." This comment seemed to push General Blackwell over the edge. His face contorted with rage, and he began gesticulating wildly as he spoke. "Tradition, heritage? This is nothing but elaborate theater masquerading as military duty. These guards are nothing more than costume performers putting on a show for tourists. A collective gasp rose from the crowd at this insulting characterization of the Queen's Guard. Several British citizens in the gathering looked genuinely offended, and the atmosphere shifted from curious observation to protective solidarity with Thomas and his fellow guardsmen. The general's inflammatory comments about the Queen's Guard being mere costumed performers created a palpable shift in the crowd's mood. What had started as curious observation of an unusual confrontation had now become something much more serious. The British citizens present understood that General Blackwell had crossed a line by insulting one of their nation's most revered institutions. Thomas felt a surge of emotion at hearing his service and that of his fellow guardsmen dismissed so callously, but his training held firm. His grandfather had told him stories of guardsmen who had maintained their posts during air raids in World War II, never abandoning their duty even when bombs fell around them. This verbal assault, however hurtful, was nothing compared to what previous generations of guards had endured. An older woman in the crowd, wearing a Union Jack scarf, stepped forward with determination in her eyes. "How dare you speak about our guards that way?" she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "These young men are protecting our Queen and our heritage. They deserve your respect, not your ridicule." General Blackwell turned his fury toward the woman, his self-control now completely abandoned. "And who are you to lecture me about military matters, madam? I have served my country for 3 decades while this soldier stands here like a statue, ignoring basic military courtesy." The woman drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable, and fixed the general with a steely gaze. "I am Lady Margaret Worthington, and my late husband served as Colonel of the Grenadier Guards for 15 years. I know more about the Queen's Guard and their duties than you apparently do, General." The revelation of Lady Worthington's identity and connection to the Guards sent another ripple through the crowd. Several people recognized her name, as she was well known in military and social circles for her charitable work supporting veterans and active military families. Her presence lent significant weight to the growing support for Thomas's position. General Blackwell's face went through several color changes as he processed this information. Lady Worthington was not someone who could be dismissed easily, and her military connections ran deep throughout the British Armed Forces. However, his pride and anger prevented him from backing down gracefully. "I don't care who you are or who your husband was," he sputtered, though with noticeably less conviction than before. "This guardsman's behavior is still unacceptable, and I demand satisfaction for this slight to my authority." Lady Worthington smiled coldly and pulled out her mobile phone. "Perhaps we should call the Colonel of the Guards and ask him to explain the proper protocols to you, General. I have his direct number, and I'm sure he would be delighted to clarify the situation." The threat of involving the actual commanding officer of the Queen's Guard visibly shook General Blackwell. He realized that his position was becoming increasingly untenable, but his pride prevented him from admitting error or backing down gracefully. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his vigil, though the situation was taking a considerable toll on his concentration. The confrontation had been going on for nearly half an hour, and maintaining perfect stillness while being the center of such intense drama required every ounce of his mental discipline. Sweat was now visible on his forehead despite the cool London air, but his posture remained flawless. A group of American tourists began openly discussing the situation among themselves, their voices carrying clearly in the tense silence. "This is incredible," one said to his companion. "That guard hasn't moved an inch despite all this yelling and carrying on. Now that's what I call professional." His friend nodded in agreement. "I've seen a lot of military ceremonies back home, but nothing like this level of discipline. That general is making a fool of himself, but the guard just keeps doing his job." These comments from neutral observers seemed to highlight the growing consensus among the crowd that General Blackwell was the one behaving inappropriately, not Thomas. The general's isolation was becoming more apparent with each passing minute, as public opinion shifted decisively against him. A young boy who had been watching the entire confrontation with wide eyes suddenly piped up in a clear voice that carried across the gathering. "My dad says the Queen's Guards are the best soldiers in the world because they never give up, no matter what." The innocent observation from a child somehow captured the essence of the situation better than all the heated exchanges between the adults. General Blackwell looked around the crowd and seemed to realize for the first time that he had lost the support of virtually everyone present. The faces staring back at him ranged from disappointed to openly hostile, and he began to understand that his behavior was being recorded and would likely be shared far beyond this immediate gathering. The weight of his isolated position finally began to penetrate his anger, and for the first time since the confrontation began, doubt crept into his expression. He looked back at Thomas, who remained as immovable as ever, and then at the sea of disapproving faces surrounding him. The reality of his situation was finally starting to dawn on him, but his pride still prevented him from finding a graceful exit from the mess he had created. The arrival of Inspector James Harrison of the Metropolitan Police marked a turning point in the confrontation. He had been alerted by concerned citizens who had called to report a disturbance at the palace gates. Inspector Harrison was experienced in dealing with incidents involving the Queen's Guard and understood the delicate balance required to maintain both security and public order. The inspector approached the scene with calm authority, his presence immediately noticeable to both the crowd and General Blackwell. He surveyed the situation quickly, taking in the agitated general, the perfectly still guardsman, and the large gathering of onlookers with their cameras and phones recording everything. "Good afternoon," Inspector Harrison said in a measured voice that carried clearly across the crowd. "I understand there's been some sort of disagreement here. Perhaps I can help resolve the situation." His tone was diplomatic but firm, indicating that while he was willing to listen, he was also prepared to take action if necessary. General Blackwell immediately turned toward the inspector, seeing him as potential support for his position. "Officer, I am General Harrison Blackwell, and I have been attempting to address a serious breach of military discipline with this guardsman. He has completely ignored my authority and refused to acknowledge my rank." Inspector Harrison nodded thoughtfully and then looked at Thomas, who remained in his perfect ceremonial stance. "I see. And you are aware, General, of the specific protocols governing the Queen's Guard and their ceremonial duties?" The question was asked innocently enough, but it contained within it the seed of General Blackwell's downfall. The inspector's implication was clear. There were indeed specific protocols, and perhaps the general was not familiar with them. "Of course I'm aware of military protocols," General Blackwell responded defensively. "I've been serving for 30 years, but no protocol supersedes basic military courtesy and respect for rank." Lady Worthington stepped forward at this point, introducing herself to Inspector Harrison. "Inspector, I believe there may be some confusion here about the guardsman's duties and the circumstances under which he can break his ceremonial stance." Inspector Harrison recognized Lady Worthington and nodded respectfully. "Indeed, my lady. The Queen's Guard operates under very specific guidelines that have been established over centuries of tradition. They cannot abandon their post or break their ceremonial duties except in very particular circumstances." He turned back to General Blackwell with a patient expression. "General, while I understand your concerns about military courtesy, the guardsman is actually performing his duties correctly according to the protocols established for the Queen's Guard. He is not being disrespectful. He is being professional." General Blackwell's face went through another series of color changes as the full implications of the inspector's words sank in. Not only was Thomas not wrong in his behavior, but the general himself had been wrong all along. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he was truly speechless. The crowd, sensing this crucial moment, fell completely silent. Even the children stopped their chatter as everyone waited to see how General Blackwell would respond to this authoritative clarification of the situation. Thomas, meanwhile, continued his stoic vigil, though he was acutely aware of the shifting dynamics around him. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but being vindicated by a police inspector while maintaining his ceremonial stance was certainly not one of them. Still, he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon and his breathing steady. Inspector Harrison continued in his calm, professional tone. "The Queen's Guard has a sacred duty to protect the royal residences and maintain the traditions that have made them symbols of British heritage worldwide. Their training specifically instructs them not to be distracted from this duty by any external factors, including interactions with military personnel, from outside their direct chain of command." The educational tone of the inspectors Explanation served a dual purpose. It informed the crowd about the legitimate reasons for Thomas's behavior, while gently but firmly correcting General Blackwell's misunderstanding of the situation. A reporter from a local news station had arrived and was now discreetly filming the proceedings. The story was beginning to take on a life of its own, with the potential to reach far beyond the immediate crowd gathered at the palace gates. General Blackwell stood frozen in place, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he struggled to process the complete reversal of his position. He had gone from being an authority figure demanding respect to being publicly corrected about military protocol in front of hundreds of people and numerous cameras. The elderly Royal Navy veteran who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, this time with a gentler tone. "General, we all make mistakes. The important thing is how we handle them when we realize we're wrong." This kind attempt to provide the general with a graceful exit only seemed to highlight his predicament further. Everyone present, from the smallest child to the most senior adult, could see that he had been thoroughly and publicly proven wrong about something he had been absolutely certain about moments before. The silence that followed Inspector Harrison's explanation stretched on for what felt like an eternity. General Blackwell stood motionless, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension. The complete reversal of his position had left him utterly speechless, a condition that was clearly visible to everyone present. Thomas maintained his perfect ceremonial stance throughout this dramatic moment, though internally he felt a mixture of relief and continued tension. The vindication of his actions was gratifying, but he knew the situation was far from over. The general still stood before him, and the crowd continued to watch expectantly for some resolution to this extraordinary confrontation. Lady Worthington, demonstrating the grace that had made her a respected figure in British society, stepped forward with a diplomatic suggestion. "Perhaps, General, this might be an appropriate moment to acknowledge that we have all learned something today about the unique responsibilities of the Queen's Guard." Her words were carefully chosen to provide General Blackwell with an opportunity to save face while acknowledging the reality of the situation. The offer of a graceful exit hung in the air, waiting to see if the general would accept it or continue down the path of stubbornness that had brought him to this humiliating position. Inspector Harrison watched the general carefully, ready to intervene further if necessary, but hoping that the situation could be resolved without additional drama. The crowd of onlookers also seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in this unlikely confrontation. General Blackwell's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The man who had been shouting commands and demands just minutes earlier now found himself completely unable to speak. His military training had taught him to handle many difficult situations, but being publicly proven wrong about military protocol while being recorded by dozens of cameras was not one of them. A young journalist who had arrived with the news crew began taking notes frantically, recognizing that she was witnessing something that could become a significant news story. The contrast between the composed guardsman and the speechless general was striking, and she knew it would make compelling footage for the evening news. The American tourists who had been watching the entire drama unfold began discussing the situation among themselves in hushed tones. "Can you believe this?" one whispered to her companion. "That general was so sure he was right, and now he can't even speak." Their observation was accurate and visible to everyone present. General Blackwell's complete inability to respond had become the defining moment of the entire confrontation. The man who had demanded respect and acknowledgement now found himself unable to form a coherent response to his own public correction. Thomas continued his vigil, aware that his steadfast adherence to protocol had been vindicated, but knowing that his duty required him to maintain his position, regardless of the drama swirling around him. His grandfather's words about the importance of duty and discipline had proven prophetic, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the generations of guardsmen who had faced their own challenges while maintaining their posts. Inspector Harrison finally broke the extended silence by addressing the crowd rather than the general. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all appreciate the dedication and professionalism demonstrated by our guardsmen today. The Queen's Guard represents the finest traditions of British military service, and their commitment to duty is something we can all admire. This diplomatic redirection of attention served multiple purposes. It provided positive closure to the incident for the observers, it reinforced the legitimacy of Thomas's behavior, and it gave General Blackwell additional time to compose himself without being the direct focus of attention. The crowd began to respond positively to Inspector Harrison's comments, with several people nodding in agreement, and a few even beginning to applaud Thomas's performance of his duties. The mood was shifting from tense anticipation to admiration for the young guardsman's unshakable composure. Lady Worthington added her own voice to the positive sentiment. Indeed, this young man has shown us exactly why the Queen's Guard is respected worldwide. His dedication to duty in the face of considerable pressure has been exemplary. General Blackwell finally managed to close his mouth and swallow hard, but still no words came. The complete public vindication of the guardsman he had accused of disrespect had left him in a state of shocked silence that was both profound and highly visible to everyone present. The reporter from the local news station approached Inspector Harrison for a brief interview, recognizing the human interest value of the story. The tale of a guardsman's unwavering dedication to duty in the face of inappropriate pressure would resonate with viewers and highlight the honored traditions of the Queen's Guard. As conversations began to resume around the edges of the crowd, General Blackwell remained frozen in place, still unable to formulate any response to his thoroughly changed circumstances. The transformation from angry authority figure to speechless bystander was complete and undeniable. The final chapter of this extraordinary confrontation began when Captain William Sterling of the Queen's Guard arrived on the scene. He had been notified of the incident by palace security and had come to assess the situation personally. Captain Sterling was Thomas's direct commanding officer, a man respected throughout the military for his knowledge of guard protocols and his dedication to maintaining the highest standards of the Queen's Guard. Captain Sterling surveyed the scene quickly, taking in the large crowd, the news cameras, the speechless general, and his guardsmen maintaining perfect posture despite the obvious stress of the situation. His experienced eye immediately understood the dynamics of what had transpired, and he approached with the calm authority that came from years of handling delicate situations involving the guard. "Good afternoon, everyone," Captain Sterling announced in a clear, carrying voice that immediately commanded attention. "I am Captain Sterling, and I understand there has been some discussion about guard protocols here today." General Blackwell finally found his voice at the arrival of another military officer, though his words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Captain, there was this guardsman." He gestured weakly toward Thomas, but seemed unable to complete his thought coherently. Captain Sterling nodded respectfully to the general before addressing the situation directly. "General Blackwell, I believe there may have been some confusion about the specific duties and protocols governing the Queen's Guard. Allow me to clarify the situation for everyone present." The captain's diplomatic approach provided General Blackwell with one final opportunity to save some dignity, but the general seemed incapable of taking advantage of it. He stood mute, his earlier fury replaced by a stunned silence that spoke volumes about his recognition of his error. The Queen's Guard operates under protocols that have been refined over centuries, Captain Sterling explained to the crowd. These protocols specify exactly when and under what circumstances a guardsman may break his ceremonial stance. Guardsman Mitchell has performed his duties flawlessly today, demonstrating the discipline and dedication that makes the Queen's Guard respected worldwide. Thomas felt a surge of pride at hearing his commanding officer's public vindication of his actions. Though he maintained his stoic expression and perfect posture, the support of Captain Sterling meant everything to him, confirming that his adherence to training and protocol had been absolutely correct. Lady Worthington approached Captain Sterling with a warm smile. "Captain, your guardsman has been a credit to his uniform today. His composure under considerable pressure has been remarkable to witness." The crowd murmured its agreement with Lady Worthington's assessment, and several people began to applaud Thomas's performance. The young guardsman had become the hero of his own story, his unwavering dedication to duty transforming him from a target of inappropriate criticism into a symbol of professional excellence. General Blackwell made one final attempt to speak, but only managed a few stammered words before falling silent again. The complete reversal of his position, combined with the public nature of his humiliation, had rendered him effectively speechless. He stood there, a proud military officer reduced to silence by his own misunderstanding of the very protocols he had claimed to represent. Inspector Harrison began the process of diplomatically dispersing the crowd, knowing that the incident had reached its natural conclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that we've witnessed something special today. Perhaps we should allow the guardsman to return to his normal duties." The suggestion was well received, and people began to move away gradually, though many continued to take photos and videos of Thomas. Now, with admiration rather than curiosity, the story would spread far beyond London, becoming an international example of dedication to duty and the importance of understanding before criticizing. Captain Sterling approached Thomas and spoke quietly, just loud enough for the remaining onlookers to hear. "Well done, Guardsman Mitchell. Your conduct today has honored the traditions of the Queen's Guard and demonstrated why we maintain the highest standards of discipline and professionalism." Thomas remained at attention, but felt a deep satisfaction at his captain's words. The ordeal was finally over, and he had emerged with his honor intact and his duty fulfilled. As the crowd continued to disperse and the cameras stopped rolling, he settled back into his normal routine, though he knew this day would be remembered for years to come. General Blackwell slowly walked away from the scene, still unable to formulate any coherent response to his public correction. His silence had become the most powerful statement of all, demonstrating that sometimes the most profound responses come not from words, but from the absence of them. The man who had demanded respect through volume and authority had learned that true respect is earned through competence and understanding, lessons that Thomas had embodied throughout the entire extraordinary encounter.